There is a moment in war when everything you have learned, everything you believe about survival, tells you to run. When the ground trembles beneath tracked steel, when the air fills with the grinding of gears and the metallic shriek of armor on the move, every instinct screams that flesh and bone have no answer to what is coming. On a forgotten stretch of road in the Philippines, on a sweltering December afternoon in 1944, one American soldier chose to walk forward instead. What happened in the next few minutes defied every tactical principle, every survival calculation, every rational expectation of what a single man could accomplish against armored warfare. This is not a legend. This is not an exaggeration. This is the documented story of Private First Class Dirk J. Vlug, 5 Japanese tanks, and the moment when courage became something almost unrecognizable. The island of Leyte sits in the central Philippines, a land of volcanic mountains, dense jungle, and narrow coastal plains carved by rivers that swell violently in the monsoon season. By December of 1944, this island had become one of the most contested pieces of ground in the Pacific War. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines 2 months earlier, wading ashore at Red Beach on October 20th in a moment carefully staged for history. But the cameras and the rhetoric could not change the brutal reality that followed. Leyte was not going to fall easily. The Japanese high command, understanding that the loss of the Philippines would sever their empire's access to the oil and resources of Southeast Asia, committed to a strategy of reinforcement and counterattack that would turn the island into a slaughterhouse. The American Sixth Army, under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, faced an enemy that refused to collapse. The Japanese 35th Army, commanded by General Sasaki Suzuki, poured reinforcements onto Leyte through the port of Ormoc, on the island's western coast. Convoy after convoy braved American air and naval power, and thousands of Japanese soldiers made it ashore, though often without their heavy equipment, their supplies, or any realistic hope of victory. What they brought instead was determination, discipline, and a willingness to die in place rather than surrender ground. The result was a campaign that ground forward in increments measured in hundreds of yards, through swamps and ridgelines, and jungle so thick that visibility often ended at 10 feet. The terrain itself was as much an enemy as the Japanese. Leyte's interior is dominated by mountain ranges that run north to south, forcing military movement into narrow valleys and coastal corridors. Roads, where they existed at all, were little more than graded dirt tracks that dissolved into impassable mud under the relentless tropical rains. The jungle was not the romantic wilderness of adventure stories. It was a hostile, suffocating environment of rotting vegetation, clouds of insects, leeches that dropped from every branch, and a heat so oppressive that men collapsed from exhaustion after only hours of movement. Diseases flourished. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and a dozen parasitic infections ravaged both armies. Soldiers learned to sleep in water, to eat cold rations because fires drew mortar rounds, and to accept that their clothes would never be dry again. By early December, American forces were pushing south along the western coast of Leyte, advancing toward Ormoc to cut off the Japanese supply line. The advance was spearheaded by elements of the 7th Infantry Division, the 77th Infantry Division, and the 96th Infantry Division, each of which had been battered by weeks of combat. These were not fresh troops arriving from training camps in the United States. They were exhausted, depleted units held together by a corps of combat veterans, and filled out with replacements who often had only days to learn how to stay alive. The soldiers moved through a landscape where every river crossing was contested, every village was defended, and every bend in the road might conceal a prepared ambush. Private First Class Dirk J. Vlug was one of these men. Born in 1924 in the small town of Grand Rapids, Michigan, Vlug was the son of Dutch immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life. He grew up in a community shaped by hard work, Protestant faith, and a quiet sense of duty that did not need to announce itself. When the war came, Vlug enlisted without fanfare and was assigned to the 7th Infantry Division. By December of 1944, he had been in the Pacific for months, long enough to understand that survival was often a matter of luck as much as skill, and that the jungle killed as efficiently as any bullet. On the morning of December 15th, Vlug was assigned to a roadblock on the Ormoc Road, a critical supply route that ran inland from the coast. Roadblocks were a necessity in the Leyte Campaign. The American advance moved faster than supply lines could keep up, and isolated positions had to be held to prevent Japanese infiltration and counterattack. A roadblock was not a heavily fortified position. It was usually a handful of men, some sandbags, perhaps a machine gun, and the hope that if something serious came down the road, there would be time to call for support. Vlug's roadblock was no different. It was positioned at a bend where the jungle pressed close to the road, limiting visibility and offering concealment, but also creating a natural choke point. The morning passed in the usual way. The heat built. The insects swarmed. Men took turns on watch while others tried to rest in whatever shade they could find. The jungle around them was never silent. It hummed and clicked and rustled with 1,000 invisible creatures, and after a while, soldiers learned to distinguish the normal sounds from the ones that mattered. A distant crack of rifle fire, the thump of mortars, the particular snap of a branch breaking under a human foot. But the roadblock remained quiet, and as the afternoon hours approached, there was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. At approximately 14:30, everything changed. The men at the roadblock heard it before they saw it, a low, rhythmic clanking growing louder, the unmistakable sound of tracked vehicles moving at speed. In the jungle, sound behaved strangely, bouncing off trees and hills, making it difficult to judge distance or direction. But this was close, and it was coming toward them. Then the first tank appeared around the bend. It was a Japanese Type 95 Hago light tank, a vehicle that had been designed in the 1930s and was, by 1944, thoroughly obsolete by the standards of European or even Pacific armored warfare. The Hago weighed only 7.5 tons, was thinly armored, and mounted a small 37mm main gun. It was cramped, uncomfortable, prone to mechanical failure, and vulnerable to almost any anti-tank weapon the Americans possessed. But the Hago had never been designed to fight other tanks. It had been designed to support infantry against opponents who did not have effective anti-tank defenses. And in the confined, jungle-choked terrain of Leyte, where maneuverability was limited and heavy American armor often could not operate at all, the Hago was still a terrifying threat to infantry caught in the open. Behind the first tank came a second, then a third, then a fourth and a fifth. 5 Hago tanks advancing in column, their engines roaring, their treads chewing up the muddy road. For the men at the roadblock, this was a nightmare scenario. They had no heavy weapons capable of stopping armor, no anti-tank gun, no support from artillery or air cover that could be called in quickly enough to matter. The standard response would have been to withdraw, to fall back and let the tanks pass, then report their position, and hope that someone with the right equipment could intercept them further down the road. But withdrawal meant abandoning the roadblock. It meant opening the road to Japanese reinforcement. It meant allowing an armored spearhead to punch through American lines and potentially threaten the entire flank of the advance. Most of the men at the roadblock did withdraw. They were not cowards. They were soldiers making the rational decision that standing in front of 5 tanks with rifles and grenades was suicide. But Private First Class Dirk Vlug did not withdraw. He grabbed an M9 Bazooka, slung a haversack containing 6 rockets over his shoulder, checked his Colt 1911 pistol, and walked out into the middle of the road. The M9 Bazooka was a recoilless anti-tank rocket launcher, a weapon that had been introduced to give American infantry some chance against enemy armor. It was a simple tube, roughly 5 feet long, that fired a shaped charge rocket designed to penetrate armor through explosive force focused into a narrow jet of superheated gas and molten metal. The M9 was an improvement over earlier models, more reliable and more accurate, but it was still a temperamental weapon. The rockets had to be armed correctly. The electrical firing circuit had to function. The gunner had to be close enough for an accurate shot, but far enough to avoid being caught in the blast or crushed by the advancing tank. Engaging a moving tank with a bazooka required steady nerves, precise timing, and a willingness to stand exposed while a multi-ton steel vehicle bore down on you. Vlug stepped into the middle of the Ormoc Road and raised the bazooka to his shoulder. The lead Hago was perhaps 50 yards away, close enough that he could see the details of its construction, the rivets in the armor, the commander's hatch, the way the turret traversed slightly as the crew inside scanned for threats. The tank's main gun was pointed forward, but it had not yet fired. Perhaps the Japanese crew had not yet identified Vlug as a threat. Perhaps they assumed that any Americans in the area would have already fled. Perhaps they were focused on speed, on breaking through before organized resistance could form. Vlug aimed, adjusted for the tank's speed, and fired. The rocket streaked forward with a hiss and a trail of white smoke. It struck the lead tank on the frontal armor, and the shaped charge detonated with a sharp crack that echoed off the jungle. The Hago shuddered, slewed to one side, and stopped. Smoke began to pour from the engine compartment. The crew did not emerge. Either they were dead, or they were too injured to escape, or they chose to remain inside rather than face what was waiting outside. The second tank kept coming. Japanese tank doctrine emphasized aggression and momentum. Stopping was death. The crew of the second Hago saw what had happened to the lead vehicle, but their training and their orders demanded that they continue forward. They accelerated, trying to close the distance before Vlug could reload. Reloading a bazooka under fire is not a simple task. The spent rocket tube has to be removed from the rear of the launcher. A new rocket has to be inserted, carefully, because the shaped charge is fragile and any damage could cause a misfire. The electrical contact has to be secured. The safety arming wire has to be pulled at the right moment. All of this while standing in the open, while a tank is charging toward you, while your hands are slick with sweat and your heart is hammering so hard you can hear it in your ears. Vlug reloaded. He brought the bazooka up again, tracked the second tank, and fired. The second rocket hit the Hago on the turret, and the explosion was catastrophic. The thin armor of the turret could not withstand the shaped charge, and the interior of the tank became a furnace. The vehicle rolled to a halt, flames licking from every hatch and vision port. This time, one crew member managed to get out, staggering away from the burning wreck before collapsing in the ditch beside the road. The third tank was already past the wreckage of the first two, its commander apparently determined to crush this lone American soldier through sheer momentum. The Hago's main gun fired, a sharp crack followed by the whine of a 37mm round passing through the air. It missed. Tank gunnery against a man-sized target at close range, with the vehicle in motion, was extraordinarily difficult, but it only had to hit once. Vlug reloaded again. His movements were mechanical now, muscle memory overriding fear. He had trained on the bazooka, but training could only simulate so much. There was no way to replicate the sound of an engine roaring toward you, the smell of burning fuel and hot metal, the knowledge that if your hand slipped, if the rocket misfired, if your aim was off by even a few degrees, you would be crushed or shot in the next few seconds. The third rocket flew true. It struck the third Hago in the side where the armor was thinnest, and the tank lurched violently as something inside gave way. It did not explode. It did not catch fire. It simply stopped dead in the middle of the road, its engine silent, its crew either dead or unconscious. The fourth tank tried to maneuver around the wreckage. The road was narrow, and the jungle on either side was impassable to vehicles. The Hago's driver attempted to push past on the shoulder, but the ground was too soft, and the tank began to bog down, its tread spinning uselessly in the mud. Vlug reloaded and fired his fourth rocket. It hit the immobilized tank on the rear deck, where the engine was located, and the Hago died where it sat, smoke pouring from the grills. The fifth and final tank stopped. Its commander must have realized that continuing forward was suicide. The crew attempted to reverse, to back away from the killing ground that the Ormoc Road had become. But reversing a tank at speed on a narrow jungle road is nearly impossible, and the Hago's driver struggled to control the vehicle. Vlug reloaded his fifth and final rocket, aimed carefully, and fired. The rocket struck the fifth tank on the front glacis plate, and the explosion tore through the thin armor. The Hago rolled backward a few more feet, then came to rest against the side of the road, its hatches hanging open, its crew silent. But the engagement was not over. One Japanese crew member, either from the fifth tank or from one of the others, emerged from the wreckage and raised a pistol. Vlug dropped the now empty bazooka, drew his Colt 1911 and fired. The range was close, perhaps 15 yards. The .45 caliber round struck the Japanese soldier in the chest, and he fell. Then there was silence, the kind of silence that follows extreme violence when the noise of battle cuts off so abruptly that the absence of sound is almost painful. The jungle resumed its background hum. Smoke drifted across the road, acrid and oily. 5 Hago tanks sat motionless, some burning, some simply dead, blocking the Ormoc Road completely. And Private First Class Dirk Vlug stood in the middle of it all, his bazooka empty, his pistol still in his hand, his uniform soaked with sweat, his ears ringing from the explosions. The other American soldiers emerged from the jungle, cautious at first, then moving quickly to secure the position. They stared at the wreckage, at the tanks, at Vlug. No one spoke immediately. What had just happened was so far outside the normal experience of combat that it took time to process. A single soldier, armed with a handheld weapon, had just destroyed 5 tanks in a matter of minutes. It was the kind of action that belonged in propaganda, in exaggerated war stories told years after the fact. Except that it had just happened in front of witnesses, with the evidence still burning on the road. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the story of the roadblock on the Ormoc Road had reached battalion headquarters, then division, then corps. Officers who had spent the entire war studying tactics and doctrine struggled to fit what Vlug had done into any recognizable framework. Destroying 1 tank with a bazooka was commendable. Destroying 2 was extraordinary. Destroying 5, alone, in rapid succession, was beyond any reasonable expectation. The engagement was analyzed, documented, and verified. The wreckage of the tanks was photographed. Witnesses were interviewed, and the conclusion was inescapable. Vlug had done exactly what the reports claimed. The strategic impact of Vlug's action extended far beyond the destruction of 5 tanks. The Japanese attack that those tanks were supposed to spearhead never materialized. The Ormoc Road remained in American hands. The supplies and reinforcements that the Japanese had hoped to push forward were delayed, then rerouted, then ultimately abandoned as the American advance continued. The psychological impact on Japanese forces in the area was significant. If a single American soldier could destroy 5 tanks with a handheld weapon, what hope did they have of breaking through American lines with the limited armor they possessed? The engagement became a symbol, for both sides, of the kind of individual determination that could change the outcome of a battle. For Vlug himself, the immediate aftermath was strangely anticlimactic. He was pulled off the line, debriefed, and told that he was being recommended for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration the United States can award. The recommendation worked its way through the bureaucracy of the wartime army, and on April 11, 1946, more than a year after the engagement, Vlug was presented with the Medal of Honor by President Harry Truman at the White House. The citation read, in part, that Private First Class Vlug had, quote, single-handedly attacked and destroyed 5 enemy tanks, preventing a breakthrough and displaying extraordinary heroism at the risk of his life." End quote. But the medal and the ceremony did not change who Vlug was. He returned to Grand Rapids, Michigan after the war, married, raised a family, and took a job as a mail carrier. He walked the same streets he had grown up on, delivering letters and packages, exchanging pleasantries with neighbors, living a quiet, ordinary life. He did not speak often about the war. When asked, he would acknowledge what had happened on the Ormoc Road, but he did not dwell on it, did not inflate it into something larger than it was. He had done what needed to be done in the moment, because there was no one else to do it. That was the beginning and the end of the story as far as he was concerned. This contrast between the extraordinary and the ordinary is one of the most striking aspects of Vlug's life. The same man who had walked into the middle of a road to engage 5 tanks with a bazooka was content to spend decades delivering mail. There was no need for public recognition, no desire for celebrity, no attempt to leverage his wartime heroism into anything beyond a simple, honest living. In a culture that often valorizes military service in the abstract while struggling to understand the reality of what soldiers experience, Vlug's quiet return to civilian life is a reminder that heroism does not require a public stage. It can exist in a single moment, witnessed by a handful of people, and then recede into the background of an ordinary life. The broader context of the Leyte Campaign continued long after Vlug's action. The battle for Ormoc raged through December, with American forces finally capturing the port on December 10th, cutting off the primary Japanese supply line. But the Japanese 35th Army did not surrender. They retreated into the mountains and continued fighting, conducting a guerrilla campaign that tied down American forces for months. The official end of the Leyte Campaign was not declared until May of 1945, 7 months after MacArthur had waded ashore at Red Beach. The cost was staggering. American casualties numbered over 15,000, with more than 3,000 killed. Japanese casualties were catastrophic, with estimates ranging from 50,000 to 70,000 dead, many from disease and starvation as much as from combat. The island itself was left scarred, its villages destroyed, its infrastructure shattered, its civilian population traumatized by months of fighting. The Type 95 Hago tanks that Vlug destroyed were part of a larger pattern in the Pacific War. Japanese armor had been designed for a different kind of conflict, one in which the enemy lacked effective anti-tank weapons, and the terrain allowed for mobile operations. By 1944, these assumptions were obsolete. American infantry had learned how to fight tanks, had been equipped with weapons like the bazooka that could penetrate armor at close range, and had developed tactics that emphasized ambush and close-quarters engagement. The Hago, which had been effective in China and in the early campaigns in Southeast Asia, had become a liability. Japanese tank crews knew this. They went into combat understanding that their armor was thin, their weapons were outmatched, and their survival was unlikely. But they went anyway because their doctrine and their culture demanded it. The men who fought on Leyte on both sides were shaped by their nation's very different approaches to war. American soldiers were trained to value individual initiative, to adapt to circumstances, to use whatever tools were available to accomplish the mission. Japanese soldiers were trained to value obedience, sacrifice, and the collective will of the unit over individual survival. These were not mere cultural stereotypes. They were real differences in military doctrine that produced real differences in behavior on the battlefield. Vlug's action exemplified the American approach. He was not ordered to engage the tanks. He was not part of a coordinated defense. He saw a threat, assessed the situation, and acted on his own initiative. The Japanese tank crews, conversely, continued forward even after it became clear that they were being destroyed, because their orders were to advance, and their training did not allow for independent decisions to withdraw. Neither approach was inherently superior. Both produced extraordinary acts of courage, and both produced unnecessary deaths. War is not a laboratory where cultural theories can be tested in isolation. It is a chaotic, brutal human experience where people make decisions based on incomplete information, fear, training, and moral frameworks that often conflict with each other. Vlug survived because he was skilled, because he was lucky, and because the specific circumstances of that December afternoon allowed his individual action to succeed. In a slightly different situation, with slightly different timing, he might have been killed in the first few seconds, and the engagement would be remembered, if at all, as a footnote about an American soldier who died trying to stop a tank advance with a bazooka. The story of Dirk Vlug is ultimately a story about the nature of heroism. It is not about superhuman ability or fearlessness. Vlug was afraid. He must have been. Fear is the rational response to danger, and anyone who steps in front of 5 tanks without feeling fear is not brave. They are either suicidal or disconnected from reality. What made Vlug's action heroic was not the absence of fear but the decision to act in spite of it. He understood the odds. He knew that what he was attempting was extraordinarily dangerous and quite possibly futile. But he also understood that if he did not act, the consequences would be worse. The roadblock would be overrun. The Japanese would break through. Men would die because he had chosen safety over duty. This kind of moral clarity is rare, and it is worth examining carefully. Vlug did not have time for philosophical reflection. He did not weigh abstract principles or consult ethical frameworks. He made a decision in seconds, based on instinct, training, and character. But that decision was shaped by everything he had learned, everything he believed about duty and responsibility. He had been raised in a community that valued hard work and service. He had been trained in an army that emphasized individual initiative. He had seen enough combat to understand that hesitation kills. All of these factors converged in that moment on the Ormoc Road, and the result was an action that has been studied, honored, and remembered for 80 years. But we must also acknowledge the cost of such actions. Vlug survived, but many others who attempted similar feats did not. For every soldier who received a Medal of Honor, there were dozens who died trying to accomplish the same thing. The line between heroism and tragedy is often nothing more than a few inches, a few seconds, a slight variation in circumstance. We honor Vlug not because he was uniquely gifted, but because he represents thousands of soldiers who made similar decisions, many of whom did not survive to receive recognition. His story is their story. His medal is their medal, and his quiet return to civilian life is a reminder that the men who do extraordinary things in war are, in every other respect, ordinary people. The passage of time has not diminished the significance of what happened on the Ormoc Road. If anything, the decades that have passed have made it easier to see the engagement in its full context. The Pacific War was a vast, complex conflict involving millions of people across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. Individual actions, even extraordinary ones, rarely changed the overall strategic situation. The outcome of the war was determined by industrial capacity, logistics, intelligence, and the cumulative effect of thousands of battles large and small. Vlug's destruction of 5 tanks did not win the battle for Leyte. It did not shorten the war. It did not alter the grand strategic calculations of generals and admirals. But it mattered. It mattered to the men at the roadblock who did not have to face a Japanese armored assault. It mattered to the units further down the road who did not have to respond to a breakthrough. It mattered to the Japanese soldiers who realized that American infantry were not helpless against armor. And it matters now to us, because it is a reminder that history is made not just by grand strategies and famous generals, but by individual decisions made by ordinary people in moments of extreme pressure. Vlug did not set out to be a hero. He set out to do his job, to hold a roadblock, to prevent a breakthrough. The fact that his job required him to walk into the middle of a road and engage 5 tanks with a bazooka does not change the fundamental nature of what he was doing. He was a soldier, doing what soldiers do, in a war that demanded everything from the people who fought it. The story also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of combat and the human capacity for violence. Vlug killed men that day. The Japanese tank crews who died inside those burning vehicles were people, with families, with hopes, with lives that extended beyond the few minutes they spent on the Ormoc Road. War dehumanizes by necessity, because soldiers cannot function if they constantly dwell on the humanity of the people they are fighting. But we, looking back from the safety of 80 years of distance, can afford to remember that every act of heroism in war is also an act of killing. This does not diminish Vlug's courage. It does not make his action less worthy of honor, but it does complicate the narrative in ways that are necessary if we are to understand war as it actually is, rather than as we might wish it to be. Dirk Vlug died on January 31st, 2003 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was 78 years old. His obituary noted his service in World War II, his receipt of the Medal of Honor, and his decades of work as a mail carrier. Friends and family remembered him as a quiet man, a good neighbor, a devoted husband and father. There was no mention of the fact that for a few minutes on a December afternoon in 1944, he had been one of the most dangerous men in the Pacific. There did not need to be. The people who knew him understood that his character was not defined by a single moment of combat, however extraordinary. It was defined by the life he lived afterward, by the choices he made every day to be decent, honest, and kind. The Ormoc Road still exists, though it has been paved and widened and no longer resembles the muddy jungle track it was in 1944. The jungle has reclaimed much of the battlefield. The wreckage of the tanks was cleared away decades ago, melted down and repurposed. There is no monument at the site, no marker indicating what happened there. The only record is in archives, in official reports, in the citation for Vlug's Medal of Honor, and in the memories of the men who witnessed the engagement and passed the story on to their children and grandchildren. But the absence of a physical monument does not mean the action is forgotten. It lives on in military histories, in studies of infantry tactics, in discussions of individual heroism and the psychology of combat. It is taught at military academies as an example of initiative and courage under fire. It is referenced in debates about the nature of modern warfare and the role of individual soldiers in an era of increasingly technological combat. And it is told again and again because it is a story that captures something essential about the human experience of war, the fear, the decision to act, the impossible becoming real. If you have listened this far, if you have followed Dirk Vlug from that December afternoon in the Philippines to his quiet death in Michigan nearly 60 years later, then you understand why this story matters. It is not just a tale of tanks and rockets and tactical doctrine. It is a story about who we are capable of being in moments when everything depends on our choices. It is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, not because they seek glory or recognition, but because in that moment there is no one else to do what needs to be done. If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage, sacrifice, and the weight of individual decisions, then please consider subscribing to this channel. Share this video with someone who appreciates history told with care and respect. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. What would you have done in Vlug's position? How do we balance the horror of war with the genuine heroism of people like him? These are not easy questions, and they do not have simple answers. But they are worth asking, and they are worth discussing, because the only way we honor the people who lived through these events is to remember them fully, honestly, and without flinching from the complexity of what they experienced. Thank you for listening.